Good evening. My name is Scott Harris. I'm Executive Director of Museums at the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia. It's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to a program from one of our museums, the James Monroe Museum, which is located at 908 Charles Street in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And it's wonderful to be able to share that address and actually invite people to visit again as we have come through the challenges of the pandemic over the last few years. Both of our museums, the James Monroe and Gary Melcher's Home and Studio, are open for visitation again and for public programs. And we hope you will join us for those as we increasingly get back to in-person programming. You can go to the Facebook pages of either Gary Melcher's Home and Studio or the James Monroe Museum to see upcoming programs and look at a considerable number of archived past programs that the museums have done. Tonight, we are going to be talking about love. We are going to look at the relationship between the fifth president of the United States, James Monroe, and the first lady, not only of his presidency, but of his heart, Elizabeth Courtright Monroe. And we're fortunate to have with us to talk about this, someone very well-versed in the history, the documentary history, particularly of James Monroe, his life and times, and his family. Bob Karachuk is the editor of the Papers of James Monroe, historical documentary editing project sponsored by the University of Mary Washington and administered under the James Monroe Museum. The project's mission is to expand access to the correspondence and other public and private papers of the fifth president of the United States through the publication of selected documents bearing on his life and legacy. And Bob will talk a bit more about just how they go about that in the context of being able to look at subjects like the personal lives of Monroe and those around him. Bob brings to the papers a rigorous training and a great deal of rigorous training and long experience in documentary editing. He holds a BA from Yale College, an MA from the University of New Orleans, and a JD from Tulane Law School. He also did graduate work at the University of Connecticut, and he's worked on similar documentary editing projects focused on the early US Supreme Court, John Adams, Ulysses S. Grant, and the Pinckney family of South Carolina. And so we're very happy to have you with us this evening, Bob. Thanks for bringing this subject to our audience, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Scott, for that kind introduction. And welcome to all of you who are joining us for this presentation of James Monroe and Eliza Courtright, A Lonely Heart Finds His True Love. Again, I'm Bob Karachuk, editor of the Papers of James Monroe. I'm going to talk to you about James Monroe's experience of love as a young man. I won't have much to say about how Monroe met and courted and wed Eliza Courtright, his wife of 44 years. The surviving records don't give us much detail on that train of events, but the sources capture a few striking moments from Monroe's earlier forays into lovemaking. From these bits and pieces, we can put together a pretty clear picture of what Monroe and other young men and women of his time and place and social status hoped for and feared when they contemplated love. Before I get started, I should tell you about the Papers of James Monroe. Scott has given a start on that. The Papers of James Monroe is a historical research project sponsored by the University of Mary Washington and administered under the James Monroe Museum. Our mission is to expand access to the correspondence and other public and private papers of James Monroe, fifth president of the United States. We collect, transcribe, annotate, and publish selected documents bearing on Monroe's life and legacy. Our work is funded primarily by the National Endowment for the Humanities, but we also rely on support from foundations like the Stuart Jones Charitable Trust and from individuals like you. The Papers of James Monroe is published in print by ABC Clio and online by the University of Virginia Press. Let's begin with a little bit of background on James Monroe. James Monroe was born in 1758, the first son of a lesser Virginia planter and a subject of George II, King of Great Britain. Monroe died in 1831, a citizen of the United States of America, and an esteemed statesman. In the interim, Monroe had a long and varied career in government, politics, diplomacy, and war, during which he played critical roles in seminal events in the American experience of revolution, independence, and Republican nation building. Monroe served as President of the United States from 1817 to 1825. My talk this evening has little to do with Monroe's life in public service. James Monroe came of age during the American Revolution. Both war and independence created opportunities for ambitious, dedicated, hardworking, capable young men to prove themselves and open paths to social advancement. In early 1776, Monroe left the College of William and Mary to enlist in the Continental Army as a cadet in the 3rd Virginia Regiment. In the course of the next 3 years, Monroe fought at Harlem Heights, White Plains, Trenton, Brandywine, Germantown, and Monmouth, earning promotion to lieutenant, then captain, and finally major. Monroe suffered a grievous wound at Trenton that very nearly killed him. He served as aide-de-camp to Major General William Alexander, Lord Stirling, and he endured the fabled winter at Valley Forge. Along the way, Monroe found favor with leading men like Lord Stirling, Charles Lee, second in command of the Continental Army, and Commander-in-Chief George Washington. Monroe also befriended other rising men such as Alexander Hamilton, John Laurens, and the Marquis de Lafayette. Monroe was just 17 when he joined the Continental Army, and he was only 20 when he resigned his commission. Monroe left the Continental Army in January 1779 with the hope of obtaining a field command in the Virginia state line. The Virginia General Assembly appointed Monroe lieutenant colonel of his own regiment the following summer, but recruitment fell short, stranding him as an officer with no soldiers. For the rest of the war, Monroe was largely and wistfully sidelined from military action. Instead, he tried to resign himself to civilian life. By the spring of 1780, Monroe had settled on a plan to train as an attorney as a means to secure his private fortune and lay a foundation for a public career. For 2 years, he read law with Virginia Governor Thomas Jefferson, gaining admission to the bar in 1782. That April, Monroe was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates, and that June, he was appointed to the Virginia Council of State. In June 1783, the Virginia General Assembly named Monroe as a delegate to the Confederation Congress. He attended Congress in Annapolis from December 1783 to June 1784, in Trenton and New York from October 1784 to August 1785, and in New York again from December 1785 to October 1786. In government, as in war, the young James Monroe showed energy, aptitude, and real promise. In society, however, perhaps especially female society, the young James Monroe seems not to have been quite as adept. In early August 1784, Monroe spent 4 days aboard a sloop ascending the Hudson River in the company of London merchant Samuel Vaughan and his 4 daughters, a cabal of spirited young women aged 27, 23, 20, and 18. Monroe subsequently wrote to Horatio Gates, another major general in the Continental Army who thought well of him, mentioning that the encounter left him much prepossessed in favor of Mr. Vaughan and his family. Monroe deemed the young English women worthy and fully expected them to captivate the hearts of some deserving Americans. Sarah Vaughan, the second of the 4 sisters, did not return the compliment. She afterwards wrote a friend, "Poor Colonel Monroe, the man is in despair. He has written a letter to General Gates telling him that he lost his heart on board the Albany sloop and fills the sheet with a panegyric upon his fair one. I fear his love did not meet with a return, but we were blind and not acquainted with one half his perfections of person or mind. They were summed up to me this day and amounted to 8, which includes everything that a female can wish or a man envy. He is a member of Congress, rich, young, sensible, well-read, lively, and handsome. I forget the other accomplishment and will not subscribe to the last, handsome, unless you prove the dimple in his chin to be what constitutes beauty. And I have a doubt about the 6th, lively, unless it is agreed that affording subject for gaiety and liveliness to the company you are in is the same thing as being gay and lively yourself. Sarah Vaughan admitted being saucily inclined in her critique of Monroe, but she conveniently laid out for us a list of qualities that she and her sisters sought in a man. Again, they had said of Monroe, he is a member of Congress, rich, young, sensible, well-read, lively, and handsome. Several of these attributes can be taken by us at face value without substantial loss of meaning. We can appreciate in a general way what Vaughan intended by rich, young, well-read, and handsome. She clarifies for us her own understanding of lively. Although we could sharpen our comprehension of Vaughan's use of these terms by exploring the social and cultural context, we get the idea. 2 of Vaughan's terms, however, must be unpacked. Vaughan noted that Monroe was a member of Congress. She did so not as a consideration in itself, but as a marker. Vaughan used Monroe's office holding as a shorthand for his public standing. The community estimate of him based on his character, affinities, networks, abilities, accomplishments, and prospects. Monroe's appointment as a delegate to the Confederation Congress by the Virginia General Assembly demonstrated that the general opinion of him was quite good, or at least the elite cadre who presumed to act and speak for the public thought well of him. Vaughan also characterized Monroe as sensible. She did not mean reasonable or rational like we use the word today. Vaughan was getting at something entirely different, feeling. From the mid-18th century through the early 19th century, a person of sensibility was one who exhibited a refined emotional responsiveness to experience. The range of feeling for the world that an individual might display with cultivated approval ran from humane sympathy to artistic appreciation, to reverence for natural phenomena, to humility in the play of human events. This kind of elevated sensitivity was supposed to reflect the individual's moral and aesthetic discernment. The logic of sensibility implied, of course, that a person's refinement might be mistaken as a measure of their integrity. Before we move on from Sarah Vaughan's checklist, we should note that she didn't question which traits a woman might wish in a man or one man envy in another, but only whether Monroe possessed the desired qualities. And her sisters thought that Monroe had it all. Sarah Vaughan was not alone, however, in her skepticism of the young James Monroe's capacity for social engagement. In July 1782, Charles Lee expressed relief in extravagant terms on hearing that Monroe seemed to have finally shed his extreme bashfulness. Lee wrote gushingly to Monroe, "I have always asserted that you would appear one of the first characters of this country if your shyness did not prevent the display of the knowledge and talents you possess. Mr. White tells me you have got rid of this mauvais honte, excessive diffidence, and only retain a certain degree of recommendatory modesty. I rejoice in it with all my soul, as I really love and esteem you most sincerely and affectionately." Monroe's trip up the Hudson River in August 1784, when he made the acquaintance of Samuel Vaughan and his daughters, was the first leg of a junket to the northwestern frontier. Monroe had set out on a one-man fact-finding mission and tourist holiday meant to carry him across western New York, onto Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, over to Detroit, back down through present-day Ohio to Pittsburgh, and home to Virginia. Monroe was traveling to Albany to join New York Governor George Clinton, who was on his way to Fort Stanwix at the head of the Mohawk River to meet with leaders of the Six Nations, the Indian Confederacy uniting the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora peoples. Clinton hoped to negotiate a peace treaty and land cession. Monroe anticipated his tour of the northwestern frontier with a mixture of serious intent, healthy caution, and revealing fantasy. 3 days before boarding the Albany sloop, Monroe wrote to John Francis Mercer, a longtime friend and fellow Virginia delegate to Congress, daydreaming of falling in love with an Indian woman and having to fight off a native rival. Monroe mused, "The Indian women, I am told, are handsome, and some of their young girls are tall, quiet, majestic, and susceptible of the influence of all-powerful love. For that little villain is not contented with giving pain and torturing the feelings of those who live in the civilized world, of being the cause of routs, tumults, quarrels, ill blood, and sometimes shedding of blood in the courts of princes and among the assemblies of republics. He ranges also in the desert and the wilderness, and preys upon the heart of many a portly savage. Well, if these Indian women will not fall in love with me, I think I shall not with them. I think we are both secure. But if the former should take place, if an Indian woman should fall in love with me, what shall I do? I shall be much afraid of her having some attendant, whose heart will be under the sport of this little tyrant, that even if she makes advances, I shall be afraid to return them. Jealousy is inseparable from love. I do not mean that unmanly jealousy, that want of honorable confidence in the amiable woman who hath chose you for the partner of her joys and her cares, but a jealousy which supersedes that condition, a fear while you are in a state of suspense, doubtful of success, that you have some more fortunate rival. This kind of jealousy may seize upon the heart of this little Indian, and if, while I kissed her hand, he saw me, would I not be in danger of losing my scalp? And really, if she did love me, how could I refuse to kiss her hand? For I believe if any woman in the world gave me convincing proofs I possess her affections, she would acquire mine." Monroe's fantasy of love with an Indian woman and conflict with a native rival was not only an expression of fascination with the other, it was also a cry of frustration with civilized lovemaking. Monroe had been in the game for a long time and failed to make a match that stuck, and now he had doubt about his romantic prospects that bordered on desperation. That skepticism inspired Monroe to imagine an escape from the tension between loneliness and propriety. It got him believing that he could love any woman in the world, even an Indian woman, if only she would first prove her love for him. The young James Monroe's awkwardness in female society impacted his relationships with women, even when he felt sufficiently comfortable in their company to develop intimate connections with them. In 1778, when Monroe was a 20-year-old major in the Continental Army, contemplating whether to resign his commission, he shared a romantic attachment with a young lady, name and age unknown. Monroe had met his lady friend while serving as aide-de-camp to Lord Stirling and living at his commander's residence in Basking Ridge, New Jersey. Monroe simultaneously shared a friendship with Theodosia Prevost, a mature, sophisticated, independent-minded, and well-connected woman who made her nearby home a gathering place for Continental Army officers and other supporters of the Patriot cause, while her husband was absent, serving as an officer in the British Army. Writing to Prevost in November 1778, Monroe demonstrated an appalling callousness toward his lady friend and an overwrought admiration for the older woman. Monroe complained of the neediness of his lady friend. A young lady who either is or pretends to be in love is, you know, my dear Mrs. Prevost, the most unreasonable creature in existence. If she looks a smile or a frown, which does not immediately give or deprive you of happiness, at least to appearance, your company soon becomes very insipid. Each feature has its beauty and each attitude the graces, or you have no judgment. But if you are so stupidly insensible of her charms as to deprive your tongue and eyes of every expression of admiration, and not only to be silent respecting her, but devote them to an absent object, she cannot receive an higher insult, nor would she, if not restrained by politeness, refrain from open resentment. I might argue that Monroe's defensiveness suggests that he had, in fact, been guilty of inattention. It's easy to imagine that Monroe might have been distracted by Theodosia Prevost herself, describing to Prevost how he'd persuaded his lady friend to give him permission to travel to France without her in order to improve himself. Monroe too proudly revealed that he'd shamed her into it by comparing their separation with that of Prevost and her husband. I told my lady friend she was not the only one on whom fortune did not smile in every instance. I produced examples from her own acquaintance and represented their situation in terms which sensibly affected her. I painted a lady full of affection, of tenderness and sensibility, separated from her husband for a series of time by the cruelty of the war, her uncertainty respecting his health, the pain and anxiety which must naturally arise from it. I represented in the most pathetic terms the disquietudes which from the nature of her connection might possibly intrude on her domestic retreat. I then raised to her view fortitude under distress, cheerfulness, life, and gaiety in the midst of affliction. I hope you will forgive me, my dear little friend, Mrs. Prevost, if I produced you to give life to the image. The instance she owned was applicable. She felt for you from her heart, and she has a heart capable of feeling. She wished not a misfortune similar to yours, but if I was resolved to make it so, she would strive to imitate your example. I have now permission to go where I please. We need to be mindful that Monroe's comparison was not applicable. The two situations were far from equivalent. One involving an unmarried couple choosing to be separated for individual advantage, and the other an established couple forced to separate in response to an imperial crisis. Perhaps it's no surprise that the attachment between Monroe and his lady friend in Basking Ridge didn't last. We have no idea how exactly the relationship came undone, but in May 1779, after Monroe left the Continental Army and returned to Virginia, he stiffly assured a family friend that Lord Stirling approved of the part I have acted with respect to the young lady. Miss Basking Ridge of 1778 was not the only woman with whom the young James Monroe established a degree of intimacy and from whom he subsequently distanced himself. While attending Congress in Annapolis from 1783 to 1784, Monroe in his leisure favored the company of a certain female acquaintance, another young lady, name and age unknown. In the same letter to John Francis Mercer, in which he described his fantasy of love with an Indian woman, Monroe extolled this lady friend as one who joins to the mildest and happiest disposition that ever blessed a person of either sex, just and due regard for society and retirement, so as to qualify her to make happy whomsoever she smiles on. 7 or 8 months later, by which time Congress and Monroe had moved on to Trenton and from there to New York, Monroe panicked to hear from Mercer that his Annapolis favorite had intimated an abiding connection with him. When Mercer clarified that the young woman was in fact engaged to someone else, Monroe replied with obvious relief. Your last letter hath relieved me from an anxiety I felt from the impression of a preceding one. The previous one suggested that I possessed the good wishes, etc., of a particular person. If this were the fact, as it might have proceeded from some attentions which I paid her, which never were intended to lay myself under any obligation to her, but merely to enjoy the pleasure of her company, which I preferred to any in Annapolis while there, I could not but be uneasy. Believe me, I am happy that the lady is going to be married, as it no doubt presents to her a prospect of happiness, which I most sincerely wish her, and relieves me from all further anxiety on the subject. James Monroe, at the age of 26, was of two minds on the question of love. He could imagine falling for any woman who wanted him, but felt only relief in escaping at least two women who had shown interest. James Monroe, at the age of 27, in contrast, was a husband and a father. In the interim, he had met Eliza Courtwright, courted her, wed her, and impregnated her. Eliza Courtwright evidently had what James Monroe was looking for in a wife. So what exactly was that? James Monroe and Eliza Courtwright met in New York City in early 1785, not long after he arrived there to attend Congress. Courtwright was then 16 years old, a belle, the daughter of a New York merchant, motherless since the age of 9, the youngest of 5 children, and one of 4 sisters. Courtwright's father was a prominent and wealthy man, part owner of several privateers during the French and Indian War, co-founder of the New York Chamber of Commerce, sole proprietor of 22,000 acres of frontier land, and progenitor of a namesake town. Like many of his peers in the mercantile line, he had remained in New York City during the American Revolution through the end of the long British occupation, and he struggled to rebuild his fortunes afterward. Whatever his difficulties, he managed to maintain a refined lifestyle for his family while he lived, and he would leave an estate sufficient for his children to fight over when he died. By all accounts, Eliza Courtwright was exceptionally attractive. John Quincy Adams met her and one of her sisters in August 1785, when he was passing through New York on his way to enroll at Harvard College after 7 years abroad. Worldly and critical, Adams did not impress easily, but he liked what he saw of the Courtwright sisters, especially Eliza. He noted in his diary, "These young ladies are very agreeable, and the youngest, Eliza, is beautiful." New York society, or at least the male part of it, seems to have united in admiration of the Courtwright sisters. Adams was made aware of their allure even before he met them. Introduced to their brother while dining in a large company made up exclusively of men, Adams learned from his table companions no more of his new acquaintance worth noting than that his sisters were fine. The Courtwright sisters possessed good looks of the kind that some say drives men to bad behavior. William Grayson, another delegate to Congress from Virginia, joined them at the theater one evening when, he later wrote Monroe, they made so brilliant and lovely an appearance as to depopulate all the other boxes of all the genteel male people therein. Eliza Courtwright's appeal was not purely physical. Her dress, her carriage, and her manner also contributed to the effect. Courtwright's beauty in all its aspects would be commented on throughout her life. A visitor to the White House on New Year's Day in 1825, attending the last reception hosted there by President Monroe and his wife, would observe, "Mrs. Monroe's manner is very gracious, and she is a regal-looking lady. Her dress was superb, neck and arms bare and beautifully formed, her hair in puffs and dressed high on the head and ornamented with white ostrich plumes. Around her neck, an elegant pearl necklace. Though no longer young, she is still a very handsome woman." On the same occasion, 40 years after the fact, Elizabeth Monroe would reminisce about how she had been quite a belle in New York in the latter part of the Revolutionary War. James Monroe was not the only delegate to Congress to marry in New York in early 1786. Elbridge Gerry married Anne Thompson in January 1786. He was 41, she was 22. Her father was a wealthy New York merchant. Their first child was born in March 1787. Rufus King married Mary Alsop in March 1786. He was 31, she was 22. Her father was a wealthy New York merchant. Their first child was born in January 1787. Samuel Osgood married Maria Bone Franklin in May 1786. He was 39, she was 32. Her late husband was a wealthy New York merchant. Their first child was born in February 1787. These four men, Monroe, Gerry, King, and Osgood, might not constitute a statistically significant sample, but their shared experience of lovemaking makes for a suggestive snapshot. Each of them found for himself in New York a young, rich, and amorous bride. Gerry reminds us quite pointedly that the founding fathers engaged in sex, sometimes to produce children and sometimes just for the fun of it. And they talked about it. Having taken his new wife home to Massachusetts, Gerry wrote to Monroe back in New York in May 1786, inquiring cutely, "How are your matrimonial prospects? Fertile, I presume, for Southern soil is almost spontaneous. Mine are not yet promising, for after the loss of one harvest, a little time is requisite to prepare for another. Does Brother King make disposition for a summer crop, or does he propose to put in winter grain? As to friend Osgood's field, I somewhat suspect it is run out, unless by being unimproved, it is become enriched." In January 1786, Joseph Jones, James Monroe's uncle, having learned of his nephew's intention to wed Eliza Courtwright, offered his own opinion on the qualities to be sought in a marriage partner. Perhaps Monroe had amply described his intended wife's youth, beauty, grace, and sex appeal, and of course her father's wealth and standing, for Jones passed over such attributes without comment. Instead, he focused squarely on character, intelligence, and competence. Jones advised Monroe that a man, to be happy in marriage, needed a woman of feeling and sense and practical skill, someone who could get along and do her part. Jones told his nephew, "Sensibility and tenderness of heart, good nature without levity, a moderate share of good sense with some portion of domestic experience and economy, will generally, if united in the female character, produce that happiness and benefit which results from the married state, and is the highest human felicity a man can enjoy, and he cannot fail to enjoy it when he is blessed with a companion of such a disposition and behavior, unless he is so weak and imprudent as to be his own tormentor." Jones was confident that Monroe could judge for himself whether Eliza Courtwright had the personality to make a happy marriage, and whether Monroe himself had the wisdom not to screw it up. "You have reached that period of your life to be capable of thinking and acting for yourself in this delicate and interesting business, and I can only assure you that any accommodation I shall be able to afford you or yours and her return, agreeable and easy, will be cheerfully afforded." Eliza Courtwright must have had everything that the young James Monroe wanted in a wife. To secure her to himself, Monroe not only sacrificed his long-cherished ambition to travel to France, but also resolved to get to work at earning a living as an attorney. The opportunity for self-improvement abroad that Monroe had refused to abandon for love once before, he gave up for Courtwright. The legal career to which Monroe had earlier resigned himself with no great enthusiasm, he took up with new seriousness for her. In May 1786, Monroe belatedly updated his mentor, ally, and friend, Thomas Jefferson, on his changed circumstances. At the time, Jefferson was living in Paris while serving as U.S. Minister to France. Monroe wrote to him, "You will be surprised to hear that I have formed the most interesting connection in human life with a young lady in this town, New York. As you know, my plan was to visit you before I settled myself. But having formed an attachment to this young lady, a Miss Courtwright, the daughter of a gentleman of respectable character and connections in this state, though injured in his fortunes by the late war, I have found that I must relinquish all other objects not connected with her. We were married about 3 months since. I remain here until the fall, at which time we remove to Fredericksburg in Virginia, where I shall settle for the present in a house prepared for me by Mr. Jones to enter into the practice of the law." The young James Monroe changed after he met Eliza Courtwright. He grew up. Thank you all for joining us for this presentation of James Monroe and Eliza Courtwright. A lonely heart finds his true love. To support the Papers of James Monroe, please make a donation at www.umw.edu/online-giving. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. That was a fascinating program. Revealed some aspects of Monroe's emotional and social development that I was not aware of, and we're going to talk about that later. There's some very vivid imagery there that I have to say, and I don't mean to sound flippant or in any way dismissive of this. James Monroe is not always the most graceful writer. He can be difficult to follow sometimes, particularly when he starts going on about republics. But those musings about the Indian women were among the most cogent, straightforward, and vivid sentences I've ever heard that emanated from James Monroe's pen. Very intriguing, very interesting. We invite folks, have been inviting folks to submit questions. We'll see if we can get some of those up. We have a few things that had come up in the course of the conversation we wanted to ask about. This one, actually, I'll refer to a predecessor of yours, a previous employee with the papers, former associate editor Cassandra Good, who is now a professor of history at, I want to make sure I have it right, Marymount University in Arlington. Cassandra published a book, Founding Friendships, about the relationships between men and women of the early Republic era, and went into the different components of those relationships, often not really either intending to be or resulting in romance, but they were friendships that were founded on mutual interest, on politics sometimes, on shared social circumstances, and could be rather vivid in the writing between people. They could use some very endearing terms, but again, not necessarily convey romance. Kind of not only in the period that you talked about, but sort of casting it forward a bit through the rest of his life, Monroe had significant relationships with women in his life that were not romantic, but that were a product of these sorts of social mores, did he not?
Yes, he did. We don't have much in the way of surviving correspondence. There are a couple of letters in the catalog of the Monroe papers between Monroe and women who he was socially engaging with, not politically engaging with, not romantically engaging with. He was a man of his time, though perhaps a not entirely socially graceful man of his time. He seems to have been, he seems to have had no difficulty engaging with men. He engaged with them in intellectual, political, military, economic ways where he was clearly in charge of himself and often in charge of others. With women, he was much more, I think I would say, considerate, respectful.
Respectful, that was
Yes.
coming to my mind, yeah.
Yes. But he was engaging with them in a way that made clear that they were traveling in different circles than he was in his career, both public and private.
Right.
He was engaging with them in social ways, not in philosophical ways, not in political ways. So the dynamic is very different, both for how Monroe is engaging. He's in charge, or at least talking peer to peer. With the women, he is more reserved, more polite. It's an interesting dynamic. What we're missing are truly personal letters between himself and his wife, or for that matter, himself and his daughters, where we have hints that he may have been much more easygoing, casual, I think we would even say loving, demonstrative. But those papers, the papers with his wife, we know he destroyed. We have reason to believe he destroyed. Why the papers between him and his daughters don't really survive, that's a harder one to figure out, but odds are the daughters may have destroyed them for the same reason that Monroe destroyed his correspondence with his wife. That was private. That was family. The public history had no business having its nose in those relationships. So, yes.
Unlike the Adams, who chronicled every breath they took.
Yes. Yes, I worked on the Adams papers for a bit, and we had a sort of understanding that the Adamses never saw a piece of paper that they didn't want to write on, and they never got rid of a piece of paper that they had written on, which is actually fantastic because we get the Adamses at their very best and at their very worst. We see them more than three-dimensionally. And with Monroe, we have a very good understanding of him as a, again, as a lawyer enough, as a politician, as a statesman, as a diplomat, more than enough, but we really have no sense of him as what we would think of as a human being.
Yeah. You know, and with respect to how he approached relationships with women and the sort of private reveries and then the outward public correspondence or communications, when you think about it, Monroe came from a Northern Neck family that was respectable, by no means destitute, but also not terribly wealthy.
Yes.
He lost his parents fairly early. He went off to college, which might have provided, in normal circumstances, a chance to enter the social circle of the town of the governor in colonial times. But instead, he comes there in a time of revolution. He's almost immediately, well, within about 2 years, he's certainly caught up in the revolutionary fervor, and then goes in the army, goes on active service, is wounded, and then is reading for the law, and then only really after sort of this deferred youth in a way, or he jump-started over the normal social circumstances until he was a considerably older youth, if you can use that term. So yeah. I do wonder if that simply from a lack of practice of having these social interactions very much, it sort of put him at a disadvantage, perhaps reinforced an insecurity, maybe?
That's certainly something to speculate about, but I would throw back the similar individual of, well, sort of similar, Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr is notorious as a ladies' man, was then, is now. The difference, though, is that he came from a very prominent, well-connected, financially secure family. So he didn't have to worry about establishing himself. He more had to worry about not disestablishing himself. And that's an entirely different kind of challenge.
Yes, certainly for two people who share a lot of the same space in time in their lives for at least a good part of it, very, very different. And to that matter, Hamilton as well.
Yes.
Again, a very different circumstance. And I think in both of those cases, though, those two New Yorkers, Monroe, even though Virginia was known for its society and for someone who could be as passionate as a Jefferson, or even for that matter, a Washington, who just held it in a reserve of personality more. Again, I just don't think Monroe necessarily, from what we know, would have had the same immersion maybe into the social scene at that earlier age, just because of the circumstances of life. But again, it is frustrating that the documentary record, which is y'all's bread and butter, is just not there for us in the way it is for some others. We're fortunate, I guess, of some of those outside observations, even if they're a little subjective or quite subjective, at least they help paint some kind of picture.
Yes.
Of him. Did you find, as you were preparing this talk, was all of this substantially what you had already encountered, or did preparing this open up some information or perspectives that you didn't have before you started putting it together?
Much of this information was available, but not assembled in this way. And the part of this that most struck me was the letter that Sarah Vaughan wrote describing Monroe on the Albany sloop. That letter has been used several times before and always been taken, I think, a little bit too seriously. It has been cherry-picked for quotes showing that, you know, Monroe was kind of a goofball and didn't have it all together. And that is the image that Sarah Vaughan puts forward in the letter. And in the letter, she says, I'm being snarky. I am being snarky. But she's writing to a friend, not expecting this to get out. To me, it's important to keep in mind that her snark comes out of the understanding among her sisters that these are the qualities that they're looking for in a man. And the sisters are saying, Monroe has it all. And it's just the one sister who happens to be snarky writing the letter that has been preserved that says, oh, no. He's, I mean, the dimple on his chin, that's not beauty. And, you know, he's not lively. I also wonder, reading that letter closely, one of the qualities that he is supposed to have has been forgotten. Which one? And to me, that's a very interesting opportunity for speculation. What are the other qualities that a woman might be looking for in a man or another man envy? The one that's not mentioned, which pains me a little bit, is smart. And Monroe has sort of this reputation for not being fast on his feet. So I really want that last quality to be, hey, he's pretty smart. But we have the letter that we have. And if we look at the context, we can understand that it was written in fun, but behind it are some really generous compliments to Monroe.
Yeah.
And we need to pull forward that part of it and not just cherry pick the fun language.
That's part of the challenge, isn't it? That you have to work with the material that's available. You have to try to draw conclusions from sometimes only one perspective or limited perspective. And this is one of those aspects. As you say, his public life would be pretty well written about later on.
Yes.
His public decisions, his stance on various issues. But not only those observing him, but Monroe himself, as we know, very notoriously stingy on introspection or very much about his growing up or anything of that nature. And it can hobble your ability to form a good picture. I think you have managed to mine pretty effectively just about what there is to get at this evolution of his early relationships. And I think good contribution.
Yeah, I do think it is a very fair treatment of him, because in this period, he is still a young man. And as you point out, he's a young man doing some very serious things that he doesn't have immediate support for. He has mentors. He has mentors all along the way.
Mm-hmm.
But he's finding his own way with those mentors' help, not having a path already blazed for him. What I think we often forget is that even the founding fathers, as young men, were figuring out how to be adults. And this is James Monroe in his moment that, this is essentially high school or college age for him. Yeah. He's figuring out how to engage with the world. And he's worked really hard to do that in a public-facing way, to think about the revolution and to join the fight. But he doesn't have that many opportunities, like you pointed out, to engage in it in the private way, in the personal life kind of way. I think it's fair to approach this kind of subject with the expectation that, hey, this person's young. They're not likely to have it all figured out yet. Yeah. Can we find the moment where the light bulb goes on? And I think that I like to think that this material that I was able to bring together, these bits and pieces, give us a sense of that.
And what I still have to come back to, and I don't have a good enough appreciation of how much this would count in people's estimation of him. You see it referenced, but not as much as I would have thought. He literally took a bullet for his country.
Yes.
For his beliefs. And you look at the roster of his contemporaries who served in the Army, most of them were not wounded, or certainly not as grievously wounded as he was. And in a later era, almost every later era and before, that would be a mark of real distinction. That would be something that would set him apart. It doesn't seem to as much as I would have thought maybe around this time, or maybe it's just through lack of evidence, but he is a wounded warrior. He is someone who made just short of the ultimate sacrifice for his beliefs. And yet that perhaps he underplayed it so much that it just either wasn't generally known or he didn't want people to make much of it. There was a modesty there or a strength of character, but it has always been interesting to me that only later on, when he is president, really, and he's visiting veterans and everything, some of that really is brought up more. But I don't know whether his contemporaries are writing about a lot in his younger life or not. Do we have any indication?
There is not a lot written about him as a younger man. There is much written about what he does as a public man at the moment or just after the moment, but his earlier life, that's not really floating around. And I'm not sure if that's because it's a small world and people already know. They don't need to, because that would be the kind of thing that at that point he would want known among his peers. We're not talking about a popular democratic society where it would be a selling point like it was by the time of Andrew Jackson.
Yes.
And I do think you're right that some of it is as simple as he was relatively modest, relatively humble, at least to appearances, and wouldn't have made a big deal about it. I think also it may have hurt him tremendously in terms of a military career arc that his sacrifice of taking a bullet wasn't really rewarded with a meaningful promotion. He got the promotion, but he didn't get a command. And what good is a promotion if you don't get a command? And I'm confident that he would have stuck with the Continental Army longer if he had actually gotten a command, but he didn't, and he tried to get a command through Virginia, and that failed. So he was sort of shoved out of the Revolutionary War really early. So I think that might be another reason that his sacrifice wasn't meaningfully recognized in the military line.
I guess, and we're coming up pretty close to the 7 o'clock mark here. Not a very talkative audience tonight, not a very inquisitive audience, but we hope people have enjoyed it, and remind them that this is an archive program is being recorded, be archived on the YouTube channel of the James Monroe Museum. I do think, Bob, though, that whatever the process, whatever the difficulties along the way, I think it's fair to note that James Monroe and Elizabeth Monroe, Elizabeth Courtwright, ended up being the right match for each other, as they certainly proved over the course of a very, to all bits of evidence we have, loving, respectful marriage, as close to being a marriage of equals in that era as probably you could be. Involved parents and a real partnership union. So whatever stumbles or problems he may have had getting to that point, they both made a good choice when they made it. That's something that seemed evident from the time you've covered going forward.
Gentlemen, if I may interrupt real quick, we do have a couple of questions in the chat.
Good, okay. I wasn't seeing them on what I've got, so please go ahead.
Yes, Bob, first question is, could we get more information on some of the women he successfully jilted?
In fact, we can't. What I've provided is about all that we know. We could explore the social context of life at Basking Ridge, Lord Stirling's home, but we haven't been able to find a name. And I think this is, I think this is again a nature of the time that people avoided gossiping, at least in writing. They were happy to talk through what they were experiencing, but it would have been unseemly to acknowledge the train wreck of the relationship, whatever the romantic attachment. I do find it interesting that Monroe felt it necessary to declare that Lord Stirling said he did okay by the young woman that he dropped. I think it's fair to say that, you know, this is like normal dating, where in our age where people get together and sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't, and you try to remember the ones that work out more than the ones that don't. So no, there's nothing more to share about those two women, Miss Basking Ridge and Miss Annapolis.
Very good. So the relationship status on Facebook went to single. Do we know, another question, do we know anything about his relationship with his family that would have helped him develop better social skills?
I think Scott has sort of summarized that pretty well. James Monroe lost his parents young. He had an older sister who was married by that time, and he had a couple of younger brothers who he ended up being responsible for as the executor of his father's estate. So yeah, I think he got pushed into being the adult very quickly, and that sort of sacrificed his ability to be free-spirited. And I think, again, Scott is right that, hey, the revolution got in the way from the moment that Monroe got to Williamsburg. So, the opportunities weren't there in the time when we would normally think of as his moment of learning those kinds of social skills. I do want to point out, going back to the previous question, James Monroe very likely had already met Eliza Courtwright when he got the letter from John Francis Mercer saying that Monroe's previous young lady in Annapolis had implied some sort of continuing connection. And I sort of wonder, does that mean that she heard that he had hooked up with somebody in New York. So she had given up on him and moved on. You don't know, but you start wondering these kinds of questions because there would have been communication passing from New York to Annapolis at this moment because Congress had not too long previously moved from one place to the other. So, yeah.
So the relationship status would have been, it's complicated.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
It's complicated.
Yes.
The final question we have, Bob, is, I think you kind of already sort of answered it, but I'll go ahead and say it. Did James Monroe have any siblings?
Yes, he did. He had an older sister. He had a couple of younger brothers who grew to adults. And he was responsible for his brothers. And I'm not sure this is, something to get into at the end of this talk, but arguably he did not do a very good job as a parent of his brothers. And that might say a little bit about the challenges that Monroe was facing as a young man trying to be a role model for his brothers. And it probably says quite a little bit about the two brothers themselves and the challenges they had because they were younger when they lost their parents and they didn't inherit anything. They inherited an older brother who was supposed to take care of them.
Right.
So
Which
again, the story,
be,
it's complicated.
Which in itself would be a breeding ground for resentment.
Yes.
Right from the start.
Yes.
I from my limited exposure to this, when a family member at whatever age is, when there's an orphan situation, whatever sibling does take on that role essentially of parent or authority figure, it's not often appreciated by the other siblings
right.
To a degree, especially the younger ones. I've always thought and wondered that there appeared at least to be a certainly if not a real intimacy, a good closeness between Monroe and his sister. But again, there's not a whole lot of surviving evidence to give us more on that, right?
There's not a lot of surviving evidence. I would suggest that the fact that we don't seem to have anything that suggests any tension between them. I think the sister having been married by the time that they lost their parents suggests that she was already shunted into the adult world, and Monroe was shunted into the adult world by his father dying. So those two might have been old enough that they could consider their situation comparable. They were side by side. It also so happens that Monroe's sister, having been married already, she was already taken care of, quote unquote, taken care of because she had a husband. So she wasn't expecting a lot from the estate, having already been settled. Yeah, there's a lot of psychodynamic stuff going on in these relationships, and we have little bits and pieces to play with. So we need to be very sensitive about all the different ways it might be interpreted. And I do think that with Monroe and his siblings, yeah, being orphaned really screwed them up. But Monroe and his sister were sort of paired in that challenge, whereas Monroe and his brothers, they were on separate levels.
And now that I'm seeing, Jared, what you were, I don't know, I wasn't before, it looks like that does represent all the questions that we've gotten up to this point. And also some very nice compliments and comments about the quality of the program. So again, we appreciate it very much, Bob. This is archived along with others. We'll remind people that coming up on June 16th, the third Thursday of June, we will have one of our old perennial favorites coming back, Sketchy History, the James Monroe Museum's version of Win, Lose, or Draw, or Pictionary. And that, another programming coming up in July, we'll come back to History Trivia. So we would encourage you to go to the Facebook page of the James Monroe Museum so you can see that and other things that are coming up and other developments going on for the museum. So with thanks again to Bob Karachuk, editor of the Papers of James Monroe, and to the museum's assistant director and curator, Jared Kearney, for manning the board for us tonight. I'm Scott Harris. Thank you for watching.